Are you a small business owner struggling to nail down your brand voice? Have you hired copywriters only to discover they couldn't capture your messaging? If that sounds like you, then you need to download my free resource, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps. Once you complete these simple prompts, you will have a solid foundation for producing your business copy, whether you decide to write your own content or outsource it to a professional, like, say, me. As an added bonus, you'll be automatically subscribed to my email list where you can learn more about my writing services and receive weekly updates about my podcast, Emotional Abuse is Real. Head over to the link in the show notes to grab Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps today. Trigger warning, this podcast episode features discussions of physical, emotional, and narcissistic abuse and abortion. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Emotional Abuse is Real. I'm your host, Serene Leeds. I'm a professional writer and storyteller, and I'm so glad you're here. On today's episode, we're continuing my conversation with emotional and narcissistic abuse survivor, Josephine. A quick reminder that the name Josephine is a pseudonym to protect my guest's privacy, and that if you haven't listened to part 1 of our conversation yet, now is a good time to hit pause on this episode and go back and listen to last week's episode. For part 2 of my discussion with Josephine, we delve further into her relationship with the controlling partner she introduced in part 1. As you may remember, Josephine discovered she was pregnant by this man and decided to get an abortion. In this episode, Josephine shares her partner's complete and utter lack of compassion for her situation and how his behavior grew more disturbing as time went on. But as always, before we get into the episode, I have a few quick announcements. Please make sure you're following me on Instagram and Threads at Serene Leeds Writes. That's SareneLeedsWrites, and that you're subscribed to this podcast on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Also, don't forget to support Emotional Abuse is Real by leaving a 5-star rating and by writing a review over on Apple Podcasts. I'd also like to remind you that Emotional Abuse is Real still has a Buy Me a Coffee page, and donations are always welcome. That's because this podcast is a one-woman operation, and your donations help support the podcast's production costs. If you're interested in sharing your emotional abuse experience on this podcast, please either DM me on Instagram, email me at hello@sereneleadswrites.com, or fill out my quick and simple application form. I've left links to my Instagram, email, the show's application form, the Buy Me a Coffee page, and my free download, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps, in the show notes. As with many episodes on this podcast, I must warn you that Josephine's story is not an easy listen. At the same time, I do believe that the more we share these kinds of survivor stories, the more people will feel empowered to stop emotional abuse in its tracks. Anyway, without further ado, here's part 2 of my conversation with Josephine.
And so I eventually, luckily enough, I had the cash.
Yeah.
I was a bartender at the time, and the abortion clinic that I went to only took cash.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
so that was just out of luck that I had that much cash on me. But
Yeah.
I got up the money, and I got a friend to take me and stay and then drive me home afterwards.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a fairly liberal state. But
Yep.
what I did not expect was that walking into the clinic, there were going to be protesters outside.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were screaming at me,
Mhm.
"It's not too late. You can turn around and leave." And I was like, this is unbelievable. This is like something out of a movie that I never thought I would see. And
Did they have escorts back then?
No, I don't think so.
Mm,
They had someone at the
yeah.
door, but not
Right.
escorts. So
Yeah.
really it was just me and my
Sure.
friend.
Mm.
I was really just the two of us walking
Yeah.
in and walking back out.
Yeah.
And I'd say the one good thing about the experience was that I was asleep the whole time.
Okay.
I
Good.
was under general, so
Yeah.
I don't remember it. I just remember going into a room with a doctor and a couple of nurses, and I remember the doctor looking at me and saying, um, "Don't worry, we're going to take care of you, and everything's going to be fine,"
That's wonderful.
which
I'm
was
so
really
glad that
sweet. And
I'm so
then that
glad you
was it.
had
I
that.
was
Yeah.
out, and I woke up, and it was done, and I was in a
Yeah.
lot of pain,
Yeah.
but I was able to get home.
Mhm.
And they gave me some pain medication and some antibiotics, and that was it, and it was done. And I remember he finally, my boyfriend at the time, the father of the baby, finally came to visit me later that night when it was over.
Yeah.
And um, he just really didn't have many comforting words for me.
Yeah.
It was sort of like lying next to a stranger.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
after that, there was a very big shift in our relationship. I mean, he was already showing me signs, a lot of red flags of what kind of
Yeah.
person he was, but there was this very abrupt shift in
Yeah.
the relationship where he went from almost, I'd say, a jerk
Mhm.
to straight up abusive.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so
Okay.
what he wanted to do was essentially punish me for
Right.
having the abortion.
Yeah.
And so he started to verbally abuse me.
Mhm.
He started to insult me, you know, and eventually I became so disgusted with his behavior and I felt such a lack of support by him that I ended up breaking up with him.
Mhm. Good.
And that would have been fine if we had stayed apart. I
Ah.
think if we had never spoken ever again, I probably could have gone on with my life and just dealt with it.
Yeah.
Um, but unfortunately, 4 or 5 months after that, he reached out to me and
Yeah.
he wanted to get back together. And I
Mm.
agreed.
Yeah.
And from that point on, it was just constant jabs at me in front of people when we were alone, constantly trying to convince me to get pregnant again. He wanted this level of control where
Yeah.
he controlled every single aspect
Yeah.
of my
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we happened to be out and another man looked at me or tried to buy me a drink
Mhm.
or even said anything to me, he would immediately blow up first at the other man. And then when we got home, he would blow up at me and he would blame
Yeah.
me.
Of course. Yeah.
Um, and then the insults would start. It
Yeah.
was, you're a slut, you're a whore.
Mhm.
If you weren't dressed like that,
Uh-huh.
you wouldn't be getting this kind of attention.
It's
Mind
all
you,
your fault.
I was wearing shirts and jeans. I mean, like this
Right.
is, but even still, even if I had been in,
A
nothing.
snowsuit. It would have been
Exactly.
it would have been your fault. It would have been your
Yeah.
fault no matter what.
It's I feel
Yeah.
like it's this excuse that people make it so easy to just victim blame over and over again.
Oh God,
Well,
so
this
true.
happened, this man screamed something at me, or this, individual, accosted me. And then it's, well, how were you acting? What were you
Right.
wearing? Were you being
Yes.
flirtatious? Like,
Oh my God. So true. It's so
and
true.
it's
It's so
it's
true.
so crazy, and it's so demoralizing, and it's so insidious and disgusting, and it's still happening.
Yes.
Years later, I'm at the point where I'm in my 40s and I'm married and I have children, and
Yeah.
I worry so much about my kids and what's going to happen to them as they get older, because in a way we've become a whole lot more aware as a society of victim blaming, but at the same time I feel like there's also been this movement, especially aimed towards young men, about making them feel so entitled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I read something so disturbing the other day. I believe it was an article on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and it was about young people having sex these days, high schoolers mainly,
Yeah.
and that the girls are so shocked because when they're alone with the boys, the first thing that the boys want to do is choke them because they're seeing it so much in pornographic movies and even in
Yeah.
other movies
Mm-hmm.
that they
Mm-hmm.
think it's
Mm-hmm.
normal. They think
Yeah.
that women want it. And
Yeah.
it's so frightening to think
It
that
really is.
something like non-fatal strangulation is like becoming the kink, the new kink to some
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
It's really
Yeah.
scary.
It is. It is.
Um, but at any rate, I ended up back with this person who controlled everything I did and,
Yeah.
manipulated me at every turn. And his family was just as equally abusive and manipulative. They would
And
make
that's where it comes
comments
from.
about, make comments about my appearance, about my weight.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was constantly making comments about how we should have a baby, be it we
Ugh,
were never engaged,
the worst.
and
Yeah.
that just stung even more so because I had to terminate this pregnancy.
Yeah.
And although I knew what I had to do, it was still an incredibly difficult decision.
Yeah.
And
Of
the after
course.
emotional effects were very difficult.
Of course.
And there were moments of regret where I thought,
Yeah.
maybe I could have raised this child, or maybe
Sure.
I could have done this or that, where you're always like secondhand, hindsight questioning. But
Of course. Of
um
course.
but then of course I have to go over to this man's house where his mother is like, you should just have a baby. Are you gonna have a baby? I need to be a grandmother. And I'm just thinking to
Right, because it's
myself,
about her.
this is like torture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's
Yeah.
about her. Never mind what you want. Never mind any of that. So
Right.
sorry.
And so we stayed together, but it was an on and off thing. I was
Yeah.
constantly breaking up with him, and trying to get away from him,
Yeah.
but he
Sure.
would always have that control over me.
Yeah.
And either he would stalk me
Yeah.
if I broke up with him, or he would call me nonstop. He would text me or call me in the middle of the night,
Mm.
often drunk.
Yeah.
He would show up at my house. He would go and corner my friends and try to convince them to get back, for me to get back together with him. One night, he actually, and this was after I had moved out of my parents' home and I was sharing a house with a roommate.
Mm-hmm.
He broke into the house
Oh.
and came into
Yeah.
my room in the middle of the night,
Mm-hmm.
and scared the hell out of me, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I sat there and, I was half asleep, and he ended up just laying down next to me. We went to sleep, and I woke up in the morning and he was completely gone.
Mm-hmm.
And all I found was a handwritten note downstairs. And it said, it was very creepy. It was like, I just wanted to watch you sleep.
Ew. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was so weird. And I remember
Yeah.
calling up my friend at the time,
Mm-hmm.
the same friend who had taken me for the abortion. And I thought,
That's a good
I
friend.
have to tell her about this because I'm so freaked out. And I
Yeah.
read the note to her,
Mm-hmm.
and her response was, it just really sounds very sweet.
Oh, never mind. I take back what I just said.
Her,
I don't know if you guys are still friends. I'm sorry.
we're not.
Oh,
We're not.
Okay.
Thankfully, we're not. And her
Okay.
response was, it really doesn't sound all that bad. It really just sounds like he misses you. And it's not really that threatening. And I was like, this is insane. He broke into
No.
my home in the middle of
No.
the night.
Yeah.
I think that I should go get a restraining order.
Yeah.
And she was
Sure.
like, no, if you do that, it's going to make things a whole lot worse. You're just going
Right.
to ruin the rest of his life. And he's just sad. I know.
Oh my God. I'm so
I-
sorry. I'm so sorry.
it
I
was-
mean, and because I get it. Because I feel like there are so many reasons why I started this podcast, but one of the many is because I always felt like, whenever I would talk about someone who had hurt me, my feelings were never taken into consideration. It was always about like them. Like, well, wait a minute.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous. And
Yeah.
I I almost needed someone in my life at that point who was, like the voice of reason.
Yeah.
Like so many of the people that I surround myself with now, someone who was
Sure.
like, no, that is 100% wrong. That is illegal. What he did. We need to
Right.
get you protected. We need to get you safe.
Yeah.
Um, and no one did that. Everyone was just
So
like,
sorry.
doesn't seem
Yeah.
that bad. Yeah. A lot of
Ugh.
people have it worse than you.
Oh my God,
Um,
that's the word. Oh my God, I hear that all the time.
it's
No,
terrible.
it's terrible. It's just such an easy go-to. It's so there is something about the way the older generations were raised that this is all they know. And I bring this up a lot on the podcast. It falls to us, the Gen Xers and the millennials, to shift all of these attitudes and to break the cycles of generational trauma.
Absolutely.
We're carrying a lot. We are
Yes.
carrying a lot. Yeah.
I'm glad you said that because that is something that is a goal of mine, is
It's not easy.
to break this cycle of trauma,
Sure, sure.
and to do it for my kid, not only for myself
Yes.
and for my own sanity, but for my kids.
Same here.
I worry about the world that we are living in. We are
Yes.
going backwards on so many
Yes.
things. I worry
Yes.
about the things that I'm witnessing. And,
Yes.
I grew up in the Northeast, but I currently live in the South.
Mm. Hmm.
And it is
Yeah.
a scary, scary world down here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I cannot believe some of the things that I read
Uh-huh.
and some of the things that are happening in our, legislative process. It
Yeah.
is it is so utterly disturbing.
Yes.
Um,
I I
and
just I just want you to know real quick that I'm in the Northeast, and we do have those scary people here too. I get that it's as prevalent as
yeah,
it is in the South. I absolutely believe it. They stick out like a sore thumb up here, but they're
right,
here. But they're here.
right, right.
Yeah.
And that's the scary part is that
Yes.
it's like our rights are just being taken away from us,
Yes.
but it's being
Vote.
done in such an insidious way that
Yeah.
it's almost
Vote
like
on
people are
November
not
5th.
noticing.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what eventually happened with that same man was
Yes.
that I started to feel like I had no other alternative but to be in a relationship with him. I literally felt like I could not escape because no matter how many times I broke up with him over the years, he always found me,
Yeah.
called me, came to my job. It was like I was
So scary.
stuck in a hole that I couldn't claw my way out of,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is exactly how abusers want you to feel.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I ended up eventually getting back together with him after we had been apart for about 3 months.
Mhm. Mhm.
And he said to me, well, not, I mean, there are so many red flags that when I look back, I was like, I can't believe that you agreed to this or agreed to that
Yep.
or did this or that.
We
But
are
one of
all
the things
guilty
that
of that.
happened while we
Yeah.
were broken up, he had called me one day, obviously looking for sympathy. And he said, I got fired from my job today.
Uh-huh.
And I said, what happened? And he told me the story. Essentially, he had verbally accosted a female coworker.
And he wanted sympathy?
And he wanted the
And he
sympathy.
wanted
He was
he
like,
wanted
oh, well,
sympathy.
it was really all her fault. And I mean, these
Sure.
people are so manipulative that,
Mhm.
they attack people and then they want, like you said, they want to be the victim.
Yes.
And sorry, I'm moving around a little bit.
Get
Um,
comfy. Get
and
comfy. No one's gonna see, so it's all good. Yeah.
and so I ended up getting back together with him.
Yeah.
And he said, I've gotten a new job out of state
Yeah.
and I want you to go with me,
Uh-huh.
which at that point meant giving up my entire life because he wanted me to move out of state away
Mhm.
from all of my friends, away from the career that I had established at this point because I had a good job in a law
Yeah.
firm. So he wanted me to leave everything behind and go to a new state with him.
Yeah.
And I agreed to do it because I thought this could be a fresh start for us. Maybe this is just what we need. We need to get away
Yeah.
from his parents
Yeah.
who are, narcissistic and toxic and all of that. And
Yep.
maybe once he's out from under their,
Their thumb. Yeah.
control, maybe he can be a decent person and maybe we
Mhm.
can really make this work if we have a true shot.
Yeah.
And so, in the process of moving, it was completely chaotic. It was
Yeah.
like I was trying to look for a new job. My best friend's mother passed away.
Mhm.
And she was like a second mother to me. We were very close. And my grandfather also passed away
Mm.
in that time. And
Yeah.
so I was like emotionally just destroyed.
Drained. Yeah.
Yes. I had ended up getting really, really sick. I want to say with bronchitis or something. And so I was put on antibiotics at one point. And of course, I shouldn't say of course, but of course, in just like shaking my head,
Yeah.
I got pregnant again.
Mm.
Because the pill and the antibiotics, everybody knows that.
Yeah.
But that was not at the forefront of my mind
Sure.
with everything that was going on. And so at this point, I'm about 24 and
Yeah.
he's 31.
Yeah.
And so I get the pregnancy test. And I didn't realize for some time that I was pregnant because the
Yeah.
symptoms to me didn't seem quite right. And I
Mhm.
was also getting over being sick. And so I
Yeah.
thought something else was going on. I thought it was like a reaction to the antibiotics. I
Sure.
thought maybe I was coming down with the flu.
Sure.
I thought there was something else going on. And so I finally took a pregnancy test and I was pregnant.
Mhm.
And he was elated. He was like, "This is fantastic. I'm so excited."
Yeah.
And I was like, "You need to pump the brakes a little bit. We
Yeah.
just got back together. We
Yeah.
have had like 4 and change years of misery here. And we
Yeah.
really need to sit back and think, are we ready to raise this child? Are we really legitimately ready?" And he's like, "Well, your biggest complaint before was that you weren't old enough and that you didn't have a career. Well, you have those things now. And
Yeah.
so you shouldn't complain and you should just be happy and let's just get married and have the baby." And I was like, I am not ready to just put all of my concerns aside. We really need to talk about this. He refused to talk to me about it. If I showed any kind of questioning it, he would just immediately get really nasty and short with me, or he would just
Yeah.
leave the room.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there was no
There's no discussion.
adult conversation
Yeah.
except for the one that I was having in my own head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of weighing all the pros and the cons.
Yeah.
And so I went back and forth about it for weeks. I was so distraught. I felt like I had no one to talk to. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell, I may have opened up to one friend about it, but
Yeah.
I didn't really have anyone to talk to. And eventually it got to the point where um, we had gone out one night, he and I, to a party.
Yeah.
And on the way home, I had decided to start the conversation because I thought, we're in the car together. He can't run anywhere.
Right.
We need to talk about this.
Yeah.
So I started the conversation and I said, we really need to figure out what we're going to do. And he played dumb. And he was like, what we're going to do about what? I don't understand. I thought it had been decided.
No, he decided.
Exactly. And he turned to me and he screamed in my face, "You know what? I can't listen to your bitching for the next 30 or 40 years. Why don't you just get rid of it?" Is what he screamed at me. I was so, I don't even know what I was feeling in that moment. Hurt, anger. I was disgusted.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe that he had said that to me. And he said, "But if you decide to do this,
Yeah.
don't you dare seem sad afterwards. I don't want to see any sadness out of you."
Wow.
And I just shook my head. I didn't even
Yeah.
have any words.
Yeah.
And we finished the drive home almost in silence. And the next morning I called
Mhm.
an abortion clinic. I was in a
Yeah.
different state at this time.
Right.
So it was still available.
Yeah.
But the clinic that I had gone to operated entirely differently. I was
Yeah.
awake during the entire procedure.
Mm,
I could hear everything. I could
yeah.
feel everything.
Yeah.
And the one thing that I wish they had not done is they did an ultrasound to see how far along I was. And I
Uh,
found out that I was, I think, about 11 weeks.
hmm
And
hmm
then they showed me the ultrasound photo.
Hey guys, I'm Nick Darland, and I invite you to check out my podcast, Power and Chaos. Here's the truth. We're not the worst things that's ever happened to us, and we're not the worst thing that we've ever done either. Our power lies in how we rise from the chaos. Each week, we dive into real stories of resilience, growth, and leadership. Because chaos doesn't define us, it strengthens us. We're streaming on all major platforms. Subscribe today and discover how to turn adversity into strength.
Oh my God, that's Giving Crisis Pregnancy Center. Oh,
It was,
so sorry.
I don't know if they felt like they had to do that. I don't know if that
Yeah.
was like part of their policy.
Yeah.
And then they sort of brought me in to talk with the doctor first. And I guess they kind of like to do a little pre-chat just to make sure that you're like, in the right state of mind.
Yeah.
And I kind of explained to her, look, I understand that I'm probably not the youngest woman that you have in this clinic right now. You have teenagers sitting in your lobby. I understand that I'm not a teenager, but
Yeah.
I cannot go forward with this. I
Right.
cannot live under this man. I
Yeah.
cannot live under his control. I cannot live with this kind of abuse,
Yep.
this kind of verbal, psychological abuse day in and day out. And I won't raise a child in this atmosphere.
Good for
And I
you.
think once they heard that, they were like, okay,
Okay. Yeah.
we will do it. And we're going to go ahead and help you.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I remember going home and being in a lot of pain and being very upset and very nauseous
Yeah.
from a combination of morning sickness and some medication that they had given me. And it was much the same treatment by him. It was, I don't really care. I'm going to go in another room and play video games. And it was pretty awful.
Yeah.
And the relationship took an even worse turn after that, where he started leaving the house every morning and he would go to work
Mhm.
and then he just wouldn't come home. He would go straight from his job to the bar
Uh-huh.
with friends, and then he would party and drink all night.
Mhm.
And he would sometimes not come home at all.
Yeah.
Other times he would come home, at 3, 4 in the morning drunk,
Yeah.
and just wouldn't speak to me.
Mhm.
And it started to be financial abuse.
Mhm.
It started to be just this entire level of mistreatment. And it ended up with us having this very, very large fight.
Yeah.
And he eventually threatened me
Mhm.
and told me to leave the house.
Mhm.
And I didn't hesitate. The very first thing that I grabbed was my dog, because there was no way I was leaving without her.
Good. Good.
That dog I got her in the middle of our relationship.
Mhm.
And he didn't want me to have her because he saw that dog as something to take away the attention from him.
Of course. Yeah. Of
And
course.
something like a form of support, someone that I could spend time with, someone that I could lean on,
Someone that
which
you
is
might
really
love
what she
more than
was.
him.
Exactly. And that's really what she was. If I didn't have that dog, I don't know if I would have survived any of that.
Yeah.
And I miss her so much. She was so awesome. She was a pit bull. And she
Yeah.
was wonderful.
Aw.
But she was the very first thing I put in the car. And I
Yeah.
was like, I am
Sure.
not leaving without you. And I grabbed a handful of other things and threw them in the car. And I
Mhm.
drove off to my parents' house. And
Good.
it was interesting because the minute that I got there, my brother was actually living near them.
Uh-huh.
And I guess what I expected was to be sort of embraced. Like,
Yeah.
we got you. You're here. We're going to take care of you now, and you're going to be safe.
Yeah.
And what I felt more from my older brother, and this is the same older brother that I had problems with
Right.
earlier,
Right.
was the blame. Well, why did you do this? Why
Right.
did you ever get back together with him?
It's all your fault.
This is all your fault. This is all you're
Yep.
doing. You know,
So sorry.
and there was just that more like lack of support, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
ugh. But you know, that relationship, I think that point in my life was the first time that I had ever been single,
Yeah.
like really single. And at that point, I was maybe 25.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like I had missed out on all of these years of just being a single young woman, because it was
Yeah.
like I was hopping from relationship to serious relationship, and
Mm-hmm.
they were all sort of toxic and
Yeah.
abusive in various ways.
Sure.
Um, and so I finally decided, well, I'm here in this new place now. This is a chance for me to start over. I
Yeah.
am going to not rush into a relationship with anyone.
Right.
And so I dated a little bit. I had some short relationships. None of them were very good, but at least none of them were overly serious, I'd
Yeah.
say. So I took some time, to hang out, be young, work, find out who
Yeah.
I was.
Yeah. Good.
And I want to say a year or two after I got there,
Yeah.
um, I was contacted by someone on social media. And I
Uh-huh.
don't even know how he came across my profile.
Yeah.
He may have just been searching for like single women around the age of so and so in
Yeah.
this area.
Yeah.
But he came across my profile and he read it.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out he was also originally from the Northeast.
Oh.
And so he reached out to me and said, "Oh my gosh, we have so much in common. I was reading your little blurb on your profile, and it's so funny about being raised in the Northeast and then
Mm-hmm.
coming to the South, and
Yeah.
how things are so different and culture shock." And
Yeah.
so I thought he was funny, and I thought he was charismatic, and I thought he was charming, and he seemed to kind of tick all the right boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, this man was about 7 years older than I was
Yeah.
and had a good job, came from a good family, all those things. And I thought, okay, maybe this could actually be something.
Yeah.
And again, I walked right into a trap.
Sorry. Yeah.
The first few weeks were okay. He was treating me with respect. He was being kind. He was helping me out. He was respectful to my family when I introduced him. And everything seemed to be going okay. And then, the red flag started showing. And the first time that it ever happened, we were out to dinner with his parents.
Yeah.
And his parents, once again, I mean, it has to come from somewhere. The parents were very toxic.
Ugh. Yeah.
The mother especially, they were controlling. They were,
Mm-hmm.
Constantly throwing jabs at him,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
insulting him in front of me, insulting him in front of other friends. They were very meddlesome,
Mm-hmm.
but his mother had made a comment to him at dinner. And his way of dealing with it was to take the dishes at the dinner table in the middle of a crowded restaurant and
Uh-huh.
slam them into one another. And it made this loud crashing
Yikes.
sound.
Yeah.
And I was so humiliated, and I was also frightened because I was
Yeah.
already kind of afraid of men,
Yeah.
and that didn't help. And
Yeah.
so I tried to sort of calm him down, and I said, "Look, this isn't the right place to have this discussion with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of saying, okay, I'm sorry, I overreacted, he lashed out at me. And
Of course he did.
I had a glass of red wine in front of me that I had been drinking, and I
Yeah.
had finished maybe almost all of it. There was a little
Yeah.
bit left at the bottom. And so his father eventually looked across the table and said, you know what? Why don't we just go our separate ways for the night? Why don't you two leave and I'll pay the bill,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll talk about this later.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, that's good. Let's just diffuse this.
Yeah.
And my boyfriend at the time looked over at me and said, are you going to finish your wine?
Yeah.
And I said, no, it's extremely cold in this restaurant and I'm good.
Yeah.
My wine is cold. I've had enough. I'm ready to go. And he said, well, if I ordered a $6 glass of wine, I'd finish it. And that, it was things like that. Like it was little, those sort of little hits that started happening more and more and more.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of my conversation with Josephine on Emotional Abuse is Real. And be sure to keep an eye out for part 3 of our chat, which will drop in 1 week's time. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast, please reach out via email at hello@sereneleadsrights.com, through Instagram at sereneleadsrights, or fill out my guest application form. Please note that this podcast should not be used as a substitute for professional mental health services. If you are a victim of emotional abuse and need help, please call or text the Suicide and Crisis Hotline at 988, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. You can also text START, START, to 88788. Once again, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and Threads. Consider buying me a coffee and go grab my free download, Discover Your Brand Voice in 3 Easy Steps. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.